We are fortunate and honored to interview the great board game designer Mark Herman. We chatted about his time with the game company SPI, what it was like to be there, and what led to its downfall. Stay tuned, this is Legendary Tactics.
Well, so this is me as a very young man. So I was in college, and it was at the first Origins, which I think is 1975, is the first Origins in Baltimore. And I get there, and you remember I'm now a junior in college, going into my senior year. So yeah, it would be 75. So and they had a hall with guys, all the big companies, but SPI and Avalon Hill were the two dominant companies at that time. There were many little ones. And I went up to the SPI booth, and a guy who's become, is an old friend of mine now, but a guy named Kevin Zucker and a guy named Jay Nelson were standing at the booth, and I said to them, how do you become a designer at SPI? So they start, kind of, what's the right word? They were indulgently giggling at me. And luckily, this guy named Howie Barish, who was their business manager, came over and he talked to me. And he's a very nice guy, by the way. And I haven't seen him in years, but he's a friend still. Ultimately he, myself, and Berg, we used to call ourselves the Three Amigos. So we came close. He was very close to Harry Berg, and so anyway, he comes up and he explains that we have these Friday night play testing, which I didn't know about, and which will be a big part of a lot of my career in this SPI period. And he says, come by and maybe you write an article for Moves Magazine, so we get to know you and all this kind of stuff. So and I had a car. Now in my senior year, I was on the so. I was an athlete, very mediocre one, I want to be clear, but I still was an athlete on two teams at that time. I was on the swim team and the crew team. So the swim team, is a fall sport, and the crew team is a late winter spring sport, right? So weekends for me, if there was a match, I'd be on a bus early in the morning driving up to Albany or wherever where the match was. So Friday nights would be difficult for me, except that once a month, there's not a match every single weekend. Sometimes we have home games, that's that kind of thing. So I went up there on Friday. I had a car, so I would show up at Friday night. I drive into the city. So Stony Brook is where I went to school, is about 90 minutes from Manhattan, and so I'd go into the city and I'd play test. And so I play tested a couple of games. And so there was I think it was Westwall Quad 2, as they had a game called Hurtgen Forest. So that was the first game I play tested, and with Howie Barish's game in that quad. And I play tested that. And it became evident to me in that even that first play test, that here's a couple of things that are going wrong. And he said, can you write me some notes? I said, well, do you have a typewriter? So I basically wrote, and as I recall now, what I typed were verbatim what went into the game on how to handle artillery and a couple of rules. So that was my first input to an SPI game. And then I wrote a moves article. There was a game there that's still one of my favorite games, but it's really a two-player game. It's called Lee Moves North, which was a operational level Civil War game on the Gettysburg campaign of 1862 and 63. Well, the Gettysburg campaign 63, but it also had the Antietam campaign of 62 was in the game. And I wrote a moves article, which was never published, but I did hand it in. So, I went through that process. And then they asked me to come in. They were going to be holding these seminars when I was a senior. Now I'm in this is probably starting to get to be 76 by now. They're having these seminars, and they wanted to know if I wanted to come. And as it turned out, the other two people in the seminar were a guy named Greg Kostikian and Richard Berg were in this. Berg was a part-time designer at this time. He wasn't. He was a lawyer, a defense lawyer out of Brooklyn at this time. Yeah. And so he was a part-time designer. And then and it so happens that 75 is also the first time I met Berg when I was playing a game called La Bataille de la Moscova, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and Berg came in, and we were talking. That's the first time I ever met him. We were playing this battle. It's the Battle of Borodino, for those who don't know the title, and Napoleon versus Alexander of Russia. Although it was Kutuzov was the general on the Russian side, and he then got the inspiration to do Terrible Swift Sword from that. And so in early 76, I play tested Terrible Swift Sword for Berg, which was and we play. And I remember, in fact, the guy, his name is Gary Gonzalez, who's very, we've been friends since like third grade, and in fact, he's coming over to my house tomorrow to play games. So
Oh, nice.
I haven't got so and his and we always called him the Gons. So Gons and I played Pickett's Charge scenario for Terrible Swift Sword. And we were. I actually never looked in the game. I wonder if he put us in his playtesters, but I know we played it, and he'll be here tomorrow. And that's how I got introduced to SPI. And then then I graduated from college, and I'm living in a place called Southampton, New York, which is, if you think about, Long Island looks like a fish.
Yep.
This is the very end of the bottom fin of the fish.
Okay.
That's where Southampton is. It's way out. It's on the Atlantic Ocean.
Huh.
And I worked for a company called Bartlett Trees, and I was living with, I was a roommate with two girls in this house. One of those girls is actually on the other side of the apartment still, so that worked out. But we and in that summer, and I remember that there was a hurricane that hit Southampton, and I'm sitting there going like, what am I going to do with my life? Because I'm not going to be a tree guy, and then I was a bill collector for a newspaper. I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. What am I going to do? And I called up Howie at SPI saying, hey, are there any job openings? And it just so happened, this is how, circumstance, this guy named Phil Cousin, who was the receptionist for the company, had just resigned because he was going back to high school. It was like,
Okay.
it became a big deal. By the way, Phil became a big deal in the United States State Department. He eventually went to Harvard, and but at this time he was going back to, I think, his senior year in high school, and he did a couple of games. One was, I think, did he do Invasion America and War in the Ice? He did a couple of games for SPI. Good guy, and but I became the receptionist for SPI September 1st of 1976. So the anniversary just passed, for whatever that's worth. And as I was showing you, I'm not sure when you started recording, but so the first game I ended up publishing is October War in was it 61? It's 61, S&P 61. Now, and that was through the head of R&D guy named R.A. Hardy, may God rest his soul, great guy. He was actually technically the designer, but he kind of let me run with this one. So that was really my first published work, was October War. Soon thereafter was Battle for Jerusalem 67 from the it's called the Modern Battle Squad. I see it over there on the shelf. Look, obviously, 50 years later, I have perspective. I don't think I had anything of the kind at that point. I was 20. When I started working there, I was 21. I mean, my birthday is in November, so I was still 21, and I don't think I had a clue what the perspective of the hobby.
Yeah.
No, I was just, I was just getting started in my life, and I was, I had a job and I was working at a game company. I mean, it was pretty cool, and
Yeah.
I think the most notable thing that happened to me in that first month is so just so you know, the receptionist at SPI, obviously I answered the phones. So, and it was, this is like, were they push button phones? Yeah, they were push button phones at this point, but they were still push button phones with just rotary phones where you pushed a button and it did the rotary part.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it had two intercoms. So if somebody, like if you called up and you wanted to speak to Jim Dunnigan, say, can I speak to Jim Dunnigan? I say, who is this, please? And because sometimes I guess, I don't think I ever even screened a call. I just said, I want to speak to Jim Dunnigan. So I would, I said, hold, I put him on hold and I hit a button. I say, Jim Dunnigan on line 2, Jim Dunnigan, call on line 2. And then throughout the whole place, you could hear my voice, through the intercom. And then obviously, presumably, Jim would pick up the phone and
Yeah.
call whoever it
Not
was.
much of a gatekeeper, were you?
I wasn't supposed to be. This is
Yeah.
SPI. Nobody was. This is like, nobody's wearing a. This is like a jeans game company crowd. It was very. You're still allowed to smoke in the office. Jim smoked cigars, and walked in his room. It was like he couldn't even see him. There was so much smoke in there, and and I remember right after I'd been on the front desk, maybe I don't know, 30 minutes. Kevin Zucker walks up, who I had met before, and he goes, "How you doing?" And he introduces himself again, and we talk. He goes, "You need to think of SPI as a very elaborate insane asylum. And when you're on the intercom, don't talk so loud." That was the worst thing he said to me because I have a loud voice. And so I said, okay, I'll try to talk a little lower. So, and then, but the most important part of the job, and then I used to sell games. There was like a desk unit. You came off an elevator through a door and you were standing in the vestibule where the desk, and I was sitting right behind it where the phones were. I had a little desk there, but there was a closet nearby, and I sold the games. So, I mean, maybe I saw, well, Friday nights would be different. That's when everybody came in for the playtest. We could talk about that a little bit more. That's, I think,
Yeah.
a big important part of SPI, by the way, to
Yes.
talk about, and something I had a lot of perspective on because I was involved in it, both as not a SPI person and as a person there. And let's say I saw, other than Friday nights, I would see maybe 5 people a week, a person a day buying games, and maybe 2 one day, none the next day. So it wasn't like, not like it was up on we were on the 4th floor, I think. So, you just didn't wander in off the street unless you were coming here, that kind of thing. It wasn't a random place to show up at. And so I did that. And, I was, I would do some photocopy. There was a photocopy machine bay very close by. So a lot of people would say, "Hey, can you photocopy this for me?" And I would just, I remember that it doesn't have a feeder, so you had to put them in one at a time and all that kind of stuff. And SPI worked off. I could talk also a little bit about, in some detail, about the SPI business model of how we did projects to budgets. But anyway, somebody would come in and say, "I need you to do this, and I'll give you 15 minutes or 30 minutes," and they would give you a number. And you had a time card. And so most of my time would be, it was a code for the front desk, right? That was my main job. But if I did anything for, like, if Richard Berg wanted me to do something on the Conquerors, which is something I helped them with, if I did an hour's worth of work, there would be a code for the Conquerors. I'd fill it in, and 1 hour. And so of my paycheck, which, by the way, I was making minimum wage in New York, and that time was $2.50 an hour. So my paycheck per week was $100.
Oh, wow.
Minus taxes, it was $89.87.
Yeah.
That was my pay for beginners. And by the way, even then, it wasn't a lot. It sounds like not a lot of money. It wasn't a lot of money even then, by the way.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear. When I eventually, soon thereafter, was living in an apartment in New York, I pretty much, about a quarter of my income was left over to eat. So I used to do a lot of other things to try. I'll talk about how I made extra money legally. So I come back to business model. That's in Strategy and Tactics magazine. So Jim is. I know this story from Jim. So Jim Dunnigan, by the way. If I say Jim, JFD Dunnigan, but I call him the boss. He's the only person in my entire life that I still call the boss. When I see him at lunch today with Al Nofi, which I do about 3 or 4 times a year, and today just happened to be the day I'm going to see them.
Yeah.
I'll ask you your questions.
Yes. It's an SPI day.
It's an SPI day, apparently. Who knew that was going to happen? The magazine, he bought it from a guy named Chris Wagner, who later on was the last, I guess, CEO of SPI when it went under, which is kind of another story. I was there at the fall, as it were. I was at the rise and the fall, so
Yeah.
I'm like Gibbon, only I left out the middle part. Circulation, okay, so this is March, April 1977, and the front of the magazine says circulation at that time is 31,500 is because this, if you didn't know, like in a magazine,
Yeah. Yep.
that because I was later on the advertising manager for the company, so that is like almost like an official thing that you put out when you're trying to get ads. They say, well, what's your circulation? And you literally give them a copy of here's the latest magazine in our numbers. That's the kind of thing you would do. So I knew where it was. I just had to go find it. So the magazine was the bread and butter, and the big breakthrough, of course, is that every 2 months, we never could figure out if that's bi-monthly or every other month. I mean, I don't know how you call it. Bi-monthly sounds like you should do it twice a month, right? But
Yes.
I don't know. Maybe it's six times.
That might be semi-monthly.
Semi-monthly,
Yeah.
whatever it was. I never got the right terminology, but I'll take yours over anything else I've failed at. But 6 times a year, you got a subscription, and that would have a game in it. But what and I can talk a little bit about Stonewall and what was the other game we sold? But an idea my father gave me when I was advertising manager. But basically, Jim had figured out that an average subscriber at that time would buy about $40 to $50 worth of games that were not in the magazine. So he looked at so the magazine made money on its own, but it was this thing is, here's the ad for First World War quad and Full the Gap, and the thing is full of advertising. Here's Moose magazine, etc. So the advertising would get you another $40, $50 per person. So if you want to figure out what our revenue was, you could basically take 30,000. I don't know what the subscription is, but that 30,000 would throw off times $50 extra revenue a year is how he did Jim was a big numbers guy, and remember his post SPI career was in Wall Street. So he was a savant at, I don't think he definitely does not have a degree in that, but he knows how to do it. It doesn't matter. So Jim, that was the basic business model. And in fact, what happened was down the road when I became the advertising manager, I was working for Howie. I was a game. I'll talk about my schedule. I used to get there at noon. Later on in my career, not very later. I was only there for 2.5 years, but after about 6, 7 months there, I was living in an apartment in Manhattan, and I would get in at noon because I was basically up till dawn every night because I was young, and I had a group of guys I ran around with, and we, did things that guys looking for girls do at that time in their lives, and you get involved with the Village in Manhattan at 2 o'clock in the morning is really interesting. I used to see Al Pacino all the time with his girlfriend at the time, and a bunch of a lot of the celebrities that big time actors. I would see them on the streets because that's when they're out, in the various clubs. But anyway, going back to, so I used to get in at noon, and I would then be the advertising manager for about 3 or 4 hours because that's when the businesses were open and I could talk to people. And then from like 5 o'clock till midnight, I was a game designer, and around midnight I would go home, and then go out. And be out there do that again. So that, I was young, but that was my basic schedule in those days. And when you're the advertising manager, my father said to me, I was saying I need an idea for an ad. He goes, people love free stuff. He was a salesman. People love free stuff. So I did some math, which Jim appreciated, and I figured out that if we gave away a game I had done called Stonewall, we had them, and it was and Panzer Group Guderian. So that was the Panzer Group Guderian Stonewall ads, and if you got a subscription, you got a free game, and the game cost was something like $3. But if you're going to get a subscriber and you're going to get $40 from them, even in the first year, you're going to come out 10 times to the good for each subscription where you gave away a game. And Jim loved that. And that was one of the most successful advertising campaigns we had because it pumped up about 5,000 or 6,000 more subscribers out of that.
Wow.
Who doesn't want a free game? My father knew people's, my father knew what motivates people. They love free stuff. And the internet, that's one of the biggest problems with the internet. Everybody thinks everything on the internet's free. Now when they started wanting to charge people, what do you mean charge me? The internet's free. But we've gotten past that now. But In the
Yeah.
beginning, it was free. Yeah, so Friday night is the place was open to the public, and there was a very, I mean, when I say people showed up, I mean, on an average Friday night, it could be as many as 100 people showed up. I mean, this is not like a small, it was every Friday was like a small game convention. I see
Wow.
game conventions online where people are, hey, 20 or 30 of us got together and we had, for the weekend here in Canada, and we
Yeah.
played games all weekend. I mean, every Friday was like, it was 100 would be the upper end, but it was always like 60, 70 people coming in. I was just at a convention in Newport this summer, and we had 70 people. It was a small one in the museum for SD HisCon, but that was a regular Friday night at SPI. And what would happen is people would come in. Now, every designer typically would have a stable of guys they had latched on to them. So eventually I had my crowd, and then you would give them. And that was the other thing about the discipline of being a game designer Friday night is you had to give them so you had to have a up and running game when you're giving games to somebody, say, here, play this game. Now, early on, you could teach it to them and you could watch them, but very quickly, you gave them, here's the map, here are the counters, here are the rules, and they would read, so they would be playing the game. So you always had a game. That's an important part. And I just finished, my book, by the way, War Games According to Mark. I hear has been printed, and it's landing in Oakland, California imminently, which means
Oh,
distributed. It'll be distributed within this calendar year, hopefully even by my 70th birthday, which is what I was always hoping for, November 18th. So we'll see if I can get, my book out there. But it looks like it might actually happen just
great.
in time. But the point of that all is that my method that I talk about and how to design a game is rooted in this. I'm going to give you a game, not I have ideas and I watch you play it and I'll work on the rules over time. There was always a game. So Friday night was a discipline that was enforced on the designers because of the very regular crowd showing up to play these games. And so the games and that was probably another part of SPI's, everything got play tested a lot. By a lot of not random people. That would be strange, but a lot. Remember, it's New York, so you're getting a lot of New York high school, college, or even and real business people. And I mean, we had guys coming in here. Dunnigan particularly had a crowd. These are guys coming in from Wall Street in suits, and they're coming. I mean, Sterling Hart and all these guys would come rolling in, and they'd take their ties. They'd be wearing suit jackets and they take their ties off, and they're playing a game with, some kid that in junior high school, or high school. But that's what was going on here. It's like almost like a chess club only for war games, and everything got played, and then there was and there was people all over the place. We had a lot of there was not to go into the layout, but there was a very long hallway. One end was Dunnigan, and then I don't know, it was the length of the building hallway, and the other. So Jim is at one corner of the building, and Dunnigan and Redmond's at the other end corner of the building, and that hallway is the width of this, a Manhattan building, so it's not more than a few feet. I mean, I'd say it's probably like I don't know, 100 feet or so, maybe a little bit more, and down the window side is all the designer offices. That's where my office was. Not well, once I got off the front desk, but I had an office there. And then to the right of it were these playtest rooms, interior rooms that were games were always set up in there. And then there was a conference room that got turned into a playtest room. And then there was a card room in the front. So we had people everywhere, sitting there playing games, and it was very crowded. And of course, when I was talking about and when that 1 month that I was the receptionist, I was off the desk after a month because I started designing a lot, and they got somebody else to do the desk. I would sell game people. These kids would buy games. Even the
Yeah.
adult, anybody who was there could buy games. And so no discount, of course. This is SPI. It was eclectic. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
It was a real melting pot of Manhattan. I mean, literally. I mean, the biggest. It was diverse in both, not gender. I think it was 99.9% male, but all races, colors, creeds, and ages. Mostly the huge age diversity. I mean, when you have a Wall Street guy who's 50 years old, and you have kids that are in junior high school, and you got to remember, New York kids, go commute to school by subway. So by 12 or 13, they're very sophisticated as far as moving around the city. And so this is Friday night, and they're out there till 11 o'clock at night, and there's no parents around. They just kid shows up, plays games, and goes home.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the crowd that was there, and very, you know, it was an interesting atmosphere. That playtest machine. Well, the reason for the furious pace is, again, going back to this. So there's something called a web. I assume they still have something like this. A web press. A web press. Anytime you see a movie where they show you newspapers being made on these gigantic machines.
Yeah.
That's like a web press. And we had a contract 6 times a year to be on a web press to do S&T, and they would do this like it was done. We would be getting downtime, but that schedule was absolutely locked in, because if we were late, if everything didn't happen the way it was supposed to, those mechanicals didn't get to the web press at a certain day and time, we would pay penalties.
Oh.
And those penalties would take a lot of profit away, because we're getting this special deal. So that getting the and that's how my career got started, really, is because monster games. So the business model, I'm trying to get my thoughts coherent here, because you're asking me deep questions about my past. So I said every game had a budget, right? So if you were October War, I was in charge of the budget for the developers. By the way, were not administrative jobs. We were like the guys really running the projects under the guise of a designer, but I handled all the money. And so if I was doing October War, I had a card, and I knew I had a budget, let's say, of, I don't know, $3,000 or $2,500. I don't remember the exact numbers, but they were low numbers like that. And every hour that I charged to the game got charged against that budget. And you were expected to deliver the game on time, completed to the art department on budget. And if you didn't do that, you were going to keep your job. Let's be clear. Dunnigan, by the way, wonderful guy to work for. Not passive aggressive, the exact opposite of passive aggressive. Jim would come up to you and say, "Look, you're screwing up. Here's exactly how you're screwing up. Stop." And if he came back to tell you the second time that you were still doing it, it was usually to tell you to, this is your last day. It was not 3 strikes and you're out. It was, I warn, I give you my feedback, and it's immediately implemented or else. And that's how I got along with it. I totally knew where he was coming from. I knew every word out of his mouth he meant. And now we're still, and like I said, we're still having, here I am, I'm 70 years old, we're a long time ago, and we're still having lunch together. So, obviously I got it. Not everybody did, but
but he's still boss.
Still the boss, man. Oh yeah. So you had this budget, you had to get these games done, and so what ends up happening is Berg does Terrible Swift Sword, and that's what we euphemistically call the beginning of the monster game era. So now La Bataille de la Moscova hits the world, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, I love that!" This is like, And remember, so La Bataille de la Moscova, I get to the first Origins, and I have $35 to buy games. That's my budget, and $35 should buy you in that period of time at least 6 games, maybe 7, depending on what you buy. Games were like $4 to $5, $6, would be an expensive one. I walk in the hall, right away I see this gigantic game with all these counters, and I go, "What the hell is this?" And the guy, Larry Groves, who was the designer, he explains this game to me. I hadn't been in the hall, by the way, 4 minutes. And the game is $35. So I'm in the hall 4 minutes, and my whole budget's gone. And I think gamers, in a general rule, are not really good with budgets when they get around games they want. So now I'm out of money, and I have this game. And then that afternoon, I'm walking around, I'm playing, looking at people playing games, and Larry finds me, and apparently I'm the only guy who bought the game at that point. He goes, "Hey, I'm going to get it. I'm not selling a lot of games." Yeah, of course, you're $35. Everybody else is $5.
Yeah.
Only an idiot like me would be the first one in the trial. And so he sets up a game and and we start playing a game. And so I play Leviskova at the first Origins from like the afternoon of the first day straight through till dawn on, on Sunday. And that's how I meet Berg Saturday night. So that's what I did with my first Origins. What did you do? All I know, I don't think I even slept in the bed 10 minutes the whole time I had a room bed. I don't think I went to that dorm room for 10 minutes, brushed my teeth, maybe took a shower. That was it. And just played Love a Tie. And that was also in that hall when I had some time. That's how I met the SPI guy. So that sets off this thing. Berg does Terrible Sword. And then there's this guy named Jay Nelson, also an old friend, who does Highway to the Reich. Now, so this is a long way to answer your question. I apologize, but that's what I'm not really good at these. Like I'm like missioner. I start like the volcano comes out of the ocean and we have Hawaii someday. So Highway to the Reich is behind schedule, and Jay Nelson has multiple S&T games. That goes back to the web pressing. You have to have the S&T games have got to be finished and going to the press on an exact moment. And you could just back up from that moment, how much time does the art department need and all this kind of stuff. And one of the games that Jay Nelson was supposed to be doing was So I'm at an R&D meeting. And one of the things about being the front desk receptionist is you are still part of the R&D department was controlled the front desk because they sold games. So I was the lowest member of the R&D staff. I took the job because I would be the lowest member of the R&D staff. So I was in the R&D staff technically, even though I was the receptionist of the company because it belonged to that department. And I'm at the R&D meeting, and Irad Hardy goes, because Jay is behind schedule, and he went way over budget, by the way, but Jay was beloved. He survived. We need to reassign his S&T games to other people, and Mark's going to do October War. And I was like, what? Yeah, I had no idea that was going to happen. So that I was just, there was no like, hey, Mark, do you think you could do it? I was just assigned an R&D meeting randomly. Luckily, I pay attention at meetings, and I'm off. So when you say, when you see how this whole ecosystem is got lots of moving parts, if you're inside the ecosystem, right? October. So now I've got to immediately do October War, and October War is supposed to be Mech War 77. That's a Dunnigan design in the Middle East in the October War 73, not October 73 war, and I dutifully, go back to the back of and we had a shipping department in the back where all and there was a biggest part of the floor was the shipping department because there was racks and racks and racks of all the parts to all the games. And that's where they showed up, and then they would pack them, when they needed a game, they would, go to the shelf and pull stuff off, put them in the box, mail it to whoever. So I go back there, I talked to them. I said, I need a copy of Mech War 77. As R&D, you can get anything you need for work purposes. They gave me a copy. I played it. I said, okay. And then I redesigned it. And Irad, what a wonderful man. I go to him and said, look, would you be willing to play? I kind of worked on, I might have modified the design some. If you haven't played October War, it bears very little resemblance to Mech War 77, by the way.
Yeah.
Particularly the combat system. And he goes, sure. And we sit down and play it. He goes, okay, go with it. That was it. And then I would then meet him at lunch hours. He used to eat at this. There was a good food bar down the block, and I would find him there at lunchtime, and he would edit the rules at the bar, and I'd go back to work, and the game got published on time. And of course, then once you got one game, and it looks like you're doing okay, then I got then Dunnigan tapped me to do his next Modern Battle Squad, and I did Jerusalem 67 in there, and I helped one of the other designers with a game called Bundeswehr. So you see how everything works to that schedule. So then you said the prolific nature of the place is because you've got these 6 games you're absolutely going to get done that year, and the need for the business model to get people products that'll get you another $40 or $50 per person, it's all tied into that. And so every month, I think 3 or 4 games go, and that was the business model Jim had worked out. So when you ask the question, I may have answered it in a very elliptical way, but it's this numerical building blocks of how you get a profit out of these games that you're selling for like $5,
Yeah.
dollars, that kind of thing. So this is really a question. So Avalon Hill, first of all, remember my last job. So there's a company called Monarch Avalon Incorporated. Okay. Monarch is a printing company. There was a guy named, the CSR, Charles Roberts. I met him a couple of times. He was like the kind of guy like, get off my lawn. He was that kind of guy. Very brilliant guy, don't get me wrong, but he was cranky in a funny way, actually. I met him he was he was at least my age when I met him, and I was in my 20s. So he was an older guy at that time. And he had created the Avalon Hill Company. And the reason it's called Avalon Hill is that the company offices were in Baltimore on a place called
Avalon.
Hill.
Avalon Hill, yeah.
It's called Avalon Hill. I mean, it's not that clever.
Yes.
I know where it is. It's near a statue of some 1812 guy. Anyway, so he gets into trouble with his printer, who was Monarch. And so Eric took over the company, so it became Monarch Avalon. And the reason so we were going back to this Avalon Hill SPI thing. So remember, my last job as a head of a company in the game industry was as the executive vice president of Victory Games, which was another division of the Monarch Avalon company, which owned Monarch. There was a special, they made like these really weird engraving. Like if you wanted to make like a really fancy engraving thing, they had an engraving division. There was Avalon Hill, and then there was Victory Games. So I eventually became part of that not rivalry, but I became part of that company for the 80s, 1980s. So going back to your question, just so you understand the relationship, Dunnigan, when he was just coming up, and this part, Jim, maybe Al, hopefully when you talk to Al, you ask him that question, because Al would have a much better perspective on it. But my general take on it is Jim designed a very famous game called Panzer Blitz. And Jutland, I'm looking up my shelves. He did Jutland for them. No, the main ones was Jutland, Panzer Blitz, and he did this, and then every so often he would do, and this is the very early part of this SPI. He did a game called France 1940 that was in the magazine, but he then sold that design to. So some of the designs ended up in Avalon Hill, and I'm not sure but the big one for him was Panzer Blitz, and was a huge, huge hit. I mean, they sold, I don't know what the numbers were, but if you told me that they sold 1 million Panzer Blitz, I wouldn't. But who knows? Yeah. But it was a big, big seller. Jim would know better. I always thought that.
Got it right here.
Yeah, I got a copy right around the corner in this room where I'm at. So he did Jutland. So anyway, so there was a financial relationship between Jim, Redmond, and Avalon Hill on some of these early games. And then Jim picks up the company from, it gets S&T from Wagner. But Jim's model, so Avalon Hill, so the rivalry, if you want to call it that, was really more of a baseball rivalry. We used to play ball games against them one a year, and they had some epic games, and we had a great time. And it was never it's not a rivalry like American politics, Democrats and Republicans, where everybody wants to kill each other. This is like a rivalry where it's like trash talk, and we drink together. It's fun. It was very, very camaraderie. The guys in the Hill, I'm friends with, all those guys, Don Greenwood and I, he's a Yankee fan, they're great guys, so I want to be clear, this rivalry thing was the baseball, was really the source of the rivalry. If there was ever a rivalry, it was the baseball. And they, by the way, were much better athletes than we were. I want to be clear. Tom Shaw was like a semi-pro ball player. So a couple of us, I could hit I was one of the big home run hitters, so I could get, but Berg could barely, run. If Berg hit I remember Berg once, in the game they put him in late because Berg couldn't run like 2 feet. He was the slowest human being that ever existed, and he once hit the ball. It might have gone 3 feet in front of the plate, and he started running. And the catcher picked up the ball, and he hadn't moved more than 8 feet away from home plate, and he just like throw out. It was just that kind of thing. But they were better athletes than we were as a general rule. But there were some epic games. I think we beat them once. That was like Redmond went crazy, put it in the front of the newspaper, the magazine and everything. But as far as professionally, their basic business model, because they were a printing company and they were using the company, they had a different. Eric Dott, by the way. I learned an enormous amount of business from him when I was at Victory. Was a brilliant businessman, and he really had dominated he knew how to sell to retail, which SPI never figured that out. And so Eric had much bigger volume, so they only put out one, maybe 2 games a year, and we were putting out like, I don't know, a dozen. More than that. We were putting out probably like the 6 games from the magazine to start with, and it would be like 2 more. So we were putting out 36 to 40 games a year,
Yeah.
Relative to 2.
Yeah.
So it wasn't as much a rivalry as it was. We were like flooding the market, with product relative to hit their business models. We had very different business models. They were retail. In fact, when I was in high school, there was I won't go, but we used to have to take 3 buses to get to a certain location. Then we could walk 2 miles to we didn't have cars. It was like a child baby store. Like, you could buy cribs and strollers and all that stuff. And they sold Avalon Hill games. So that was the local place, and so we would go there to buy Avalon Hill games. My friend Gons and I would go down there, and it would take a whole day to get there and back. So that's how I got So he bought Panzer Blitz, I bought Luftwaffe. Those were our first 2 Avalon Hill games. Luftwaffe is a good game, but Panzer Blitz is a much better game. I still actually teach people Panzer Blitz, by the way. It's that kind of game. And by the way, just to go back, and Jim had produced, I don't know, Mo, you hear of Kampf, Kamph?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, so this is going back to, remember, this is the history of SPI. So Dunnigan and No-Fee, anyway, Al was part of this. Jim produced 3 little monographs, and they're actually in this room somewhere, but I'd have to find them. If I can find them, I'll take a picture for you.
Okay, sure.
He did one on D-Day, Guadalcanal campaign, and the Battle of the Bulge. Dunnigan's like a real Battle of the Bulge expert from the day. And they're like, they're mimeograph kind of things. They're only like, they're not a full size, they're pamphlet size. And where the hell would they be? Not over there. Might be over here. And they're pamphlet sized, and they were historical, like orders of battle, and and those are early Dunnigan productions from before S&T, when he was just coming out of the Army and whatever he was doing. Was getting his degree at Columbia. This is where, on the GI Bill. I think he was a corporal in the U.S. used to have a surface-to-surface missile called a Sergeant, I believe, and it was a nuclear weapon. And Jim was a corporal in that unit in Korea when he was in the Army. Pretty sure that's all that. If I got any of that wrong, it's just because my memory, it's not what it used to be, but that's pretty much his Army career. Wow. And so when he came back to New York, he's going, he's getting his degree, and he starts doing this game thing and whatever he's doing. So, he was always very entrepreneurial. And of course, I haven't said anything about my dear lost friend, Redmond A. Simonson. Love Redmond. He was, I was always, Jim was always the boss. Redmond was a mentor and friend to me. I mean, we were friends. Not that I'm not friends with Jim, but he's always the boss. He was always that relationship still holds. I'm 70 years old. I still think of him that way. even though he's only like 11 years older than me now, and that doesn't seem to matter as much. But Redmond was a jewel. What a talent! What a talent! I love watching these guys criticize SPI art. And you go, well, it's like one color, and it's just and why they do this, and they don't realize, we used to use this press in Brooklyn called COSI, COSI, and I've been there, for whatever reason, I've been there many, many times because I used to do deliveries to them, and I read and say, hey, I'm going to COSI, you want to come? And I'd go down, and that's where the printing operation was, and they had like four. And when I say presses, I mean these are like, the size of my desk, very small, all hand done stuff. Seymour was the owner of COSI, and they had a one color press and a two color press, and eventually had a three color press. I think they had
Oh,
one color press, two color presses, and one three color press later on. And so Redmond was always, and remember, every time you add, so paper is expensive, but you have to have paper. Uh, but ink is also expensive, and every color adds a lot of value. So you're trying to, make money here. So he would, like, if you did a Pacific game, he used blue paper. Blue paper doesn't cost any different really than white paper. So now I got one color already booked, right? Because the whole thing's
yeah.
warped. And then he would use, maybe like you would often the hexagon fields look like they're black, but they're really dark brown because brown gives you yellow and
Yeah.
and black. You can get brown, and then you can use yellow on blue to get green. If you
Oh,
got
wow.
paper, so he knew this. He was just incredibly adept at how to get different colors on things with the minimal amount of ink on a two color press and make it look like it's three or four colors, but
Yeah.
even when it's not. And that's real talent. That's not just like, oh, I'm drawing something on a computer. This is like real. And I used to run a thing called a photostat machine for the art department. It's one of my extra jobs. And a photostat machine is a camera and dark room in a cabinet that you put these gloves in, and you can actually take pictures and blow things up and
Oh, wow.
develop it quick, and it would develop it and come right back out like in 10 minutes. You'd have a print of something. So I used to do a lot. I used to help them out. And again, when every time I did that, I had a code, right? Mark did 1 hour on the photostat machine, doing art department for this project. That's how, you had a time card,
Yeah.
and did it in every week. And well, they didn't pay overtime, so 40 hours and you were done. So this is 1981 to 83 period. I come back. So I've been working in Washington as a defense consultant, and I knew that I had learned that business. And while I was gone, Jim had gotten a contract. So what happened? Oh, let me roll back. So when I was at that front desk there, okay, and this is important to your question, uh, the U.S. Army gave SPI a $25,000 contract, and that number is important from a legal point of view because the U.S. government can contract with anybody if it's $25,000 or less. $25,000 or less, even in today's world, they don't have to compete it. They say we want to give these guys a contract for 25,000. They just write it, and they did a game called Firefight, and Firefight was a training game for the United States Army, and it was published in it would have been in 1976 because it was already out when it had just been published when I got to SPI. So that's so that's the beginning of the connection, and that's why I'm going to go back to the fall of between SPI, Jim Dunnigan mostly, and the United States Department of Defense. So that link is created. And in the closet, remember I said there was a game closet? There was also a library, believe it or not. They actually had a library, a small room, but it was packed. It was like, it looked like a library from like there was stuff, there were shelves, but there was as many books on the floor piled up as there were on the shelves. And in a corner, the U.S. Army had given SPI every single one of their field manuals from strategy down to literally how to fire an RPG, captured RPG-7. And the stack of material was 7 feet taller than me. I'm 6'1", and it was taller than I am by a bit. And I read in the month of September in 1976, I read every single manual in the United States Army in 1 month.
Oh,
And so I became like so even on my degrees in ancient history, besides other than Dunnigan, I knew more about modern combat just from what I just read than anybody else in the company because they were all doing like Civil War games and Napoleonic games and World War One games, World War Two games. But I had all of a sudden absorbed, and Jim was really the creator of the what I'll call the modern war genre. I mean, he did Red Star, White Star, he did NATO, etc. So he had created that genre, and so that's how I ended up working with him a lot. Is because that's how I got October War. They knew that I knew all this stuff. So they gave me October War because they had seen me read. Remember, it's a small company. People would just see me reading these manuals, and they go, "What are you doing?" Oh, I'm just reading these manuals, and they saw me read every one of them. So they said, oh, "Maybe he knows something. Let's just give him the job." So it was reading those manuals that I think why IRAD gave me the game. So, there's things you do in your life that take initiative that kind of get you down a path. I don't know if that would have all happened if I hadn't read the manuals. Who the hell knows? But now going to your question, so I've left and I've now been working at a company called BDM Corporation, Braddock, Dunn and McDonald. And I used to work for a guy named Joe Braddock, who was the B in BDM. Great guy, amazing. I learned so much from that guy. I've been very lucky. I've worked for a number of people who were just, way better than I've ever become, and you learn a lot if you're paying attention. So I'm working with Joe Braddock, and I get a call from Brad Hessel, who's one of the designers, but also now head of R&D. IRAD has gone off to do something else in his life. I've been gone for a few years. I'm married now, so my life's changed. And Brad Hessel's in Washington. He said, "Hey, you want to get together for lunch?" I said, "Oh, okay, sure." So we go have lunch with Brad Hessel, and he offers me a job. And what happened was, in the interim, Dunnigan had gotten a contract from Department of Defense to do a game called the Strategic Analysis Simulation (SAS), which was a World War III board game, basically. And Dunnigan was now no longer at SPI. And now the company's being run by Brad Hessel Redmond and this guy named Chris Wagner, who was the original founder of S&T Magazine, is now the CEO, and he was a business financial guy. And so the three of them are like a triumvirate running SPI, and they had this contract, and they're behind schedule, behind budget, and they don't know how to finish it, and they don't know how to deal with the government. And remember, I've been doing this now for a number of years, so I come back. My wife wanted to go back to New York where her family was, so I took the job, and I go back to SPI running their government division, which is just me. Division, more like not even a squad, really. Really the government squad, maybe you could call it. I don't know. And there was a little bit of tension, because remember the guys in the R&D department who were in charge of this design. The reason I got hired was they weren't getting it done, and there was concern. So I took over the project, and good news is I got it done on time within the original budget, and we delivered it to the government successfully in that summer. I remember it was warm out. We went to the Pentagon and we ran World War III. And I made my connection to an admiral who eventually hired me into a company called Booz Allen Hamilton, which was the latter part of my career. So all these things just kind of fit together in a weird way. But so I was the only profitable part. Because when you work for the government, if you do your job right, they pay you, and I had to do a lot of interesting things to create this division because you had to get audited rates, and I had to do a lot of things to win contracts. And we got another contract doing a theater analysis model, which is part of the full story. And what has happened is the company's cash flow is terrible because what's happened is remember when Jim started the company, it was all direct mail. Like, you want to buy a $10 game, I send you $10, you send me a game. So I'm receiving $10 for the game. When you go retail, you're getting 1/3 that price typically, and they don't pay, and then they don't pay like on time all the time. And if you do a game that doesn't sell well, they want credits. I mean, it gets very complicated when you go retail, through distributors or whatever you do it. And so SPI is in negative cash flow, and they got so the company is going. A company cannot stay in business without positive cash flow. That's just the simplest. The profit is a motive for why you do something, but you don't stay in business without cash flow. And whereas Eric Dot and Monarch Avalon was brilliant and knew how to handle retail and were built for retail. The whole business model was handling retail. SPI never correctly went from direct mail into retail, and the internet hadn't come along yet.
Yeah.
See, like if you look at GMT Games and it's a huge success, it's an internet. They're selling direct mail. I mean,
Yeah.
you're back to, yes, you can buy it in the store and they can work in that, but most of their sales are pre-orders. You go to the printer with all your money, you get your game. I mean, it's a much better cash flow business model, and SPI is going under. And obviously I'm doing these games, but I had more time than that. So I did a game called Conan for them, and I did a game for S&T called RDF, which got published after TSR took over the company. So what ended up happening was they were dying for cash, and TSR, which is Dungeons and Dragons, I think it stands for Tactical Study Rules, because I remember, by the way, as an aside, the first time I played D&D, it wasn't called D&D yet, and the game master was Gary Gygax. And Dave
Wow.
Arneson was on my little, so I knew Dave and Gary from their beginnings. And I think the original game was called Chainmail. And I think that's why it's called TSR, Tactical Study Rules, because it was Chainmail and then became D&D. But anyway, so the Bloom brothers, who were then, Gary's now Gary Gygax at this point is not in the management. I mean, obviously he's getting royalties or, whatever, he's associated with them. Dave Arneson, and he got into a big lawsuit because they were trying, the Bloom brothers were very big on lots of lawyers who never won any cases because the cases all stunk.
No.
And anyway, so they come to SPI and they give SPI a loan. But as soon as I never saw the contract, but pretty much within 60 days after the first infusion of cash, I used to see them there. They called the loan in default, and it was a corporate takeover, and they took the company. And at that point where I said, and then one of the Bloom brothers very dismissively, he basically interviews me, said, "Hey, you're going to really enjoy moving to Lake Geneva." Like it was almost like I was an indentured servant. If you know me, from Brooklyn, I don't like being talked to that way, and you were assuming a lot here. And so that's when I went to Eric Dot and created Victory Games. So,
Yeah.
and the R&D staff came with me, and all the talents of John Butterfield, Eric Lee Smith, Jerry Klug, well now Chris Klug, and Bob Ryer and Ted Kohler, and we all just left and started a new company, and we all got to stay in New York. And but we already told that story, so you have to go see the other video to see
Yeah.
the story.
Yeah.
But the point is that it was just that we couldn't pay our creditors, and of course, as I told you, I fulfilled the rest of that SPI contract through Victory Games for pro bono, because I'm very big on I grew up in a world where a handshake, nobody had contracts where I grew up in Brooklyn. If you made a deal with somebody, you shook their hand, and if you broke that deal, everybody would know it. Nobody ever deal with you again. So it was not a world of paper; it was a world of honor and handshakes. So once I handshake on something, that's just how I am. So I did it, and but the point of the story is that that's what was the end of SPI, was this cash flow problem from retail, and the business model. We just needed, if it had been a decade later, it would have been fine. If they could have gotten through the 80s, they would have been fine in the 90s.
Yeah.
But they couldn't breach the 80s. They were a 1970s, 1970s company that couldn't get through the 80s to get to the 90s and the internet. And the direct mail business of the 70s didn't work in the 80s. And on top of that, you had this enormous competition was now starting up by things like computer games, the console games, and that also savaged the sales. But that was just starting. But that's not the demise of SPI. That was really the demise of Victory Games.
Yeah.
Or so that So when I look back at my career, I see these big changes in business and commerce, and if you're not not doing the right thing at the right time, you just don't go over the gap into the next, the next regime, as it were. Let's talk about so S&T games. So I would say, if you were to, like, I don't know if you did a poll, but I think Panzer Guderian is as good a game as any that has come out in the last 40 years. It's a Berg. It's a Dunnigan idea with a Berg fixing it and really enhancing it. That's still a brilliant game. I don't care what. So I would think that would be like one of the best strategy and tactics games. When I think about the best, well, let's talk about Monster Terrible Swiss Sword. I mean, Terrible Swiss Sword was a industry changing game. Again, another Berg game, by the way.
Yeah.
His picture's right over there. I have his picture right over there. I always like to see my old friend
Yeah.
in here. So, Terrible Swiss Sword was like was very successful. We made a fortune, and then and if you go by, like, so that's like sort of like epic games that really define aspects of SPI. I think that another thing that defines SPI is its Dunnigan's creation of what then was contemporary military modern, what they call it, modern war category. But obviously, like when I did developed the Next War for Jim, that was an epic game. But by the way, for me personally, the Next War was the most important game that I ever worked on, because that's what gave me my entire career. The SAS and the Next War got me to BDM, and and SAS got me to Booz Allen. So SPI twice bridged my career back to Washington, but Next War was an epic design, that I did with Jim, and a lot of people still talk about it. I don't know if anybody's playing it. And then you have sort of like, the epic monsters like War in Europe and War in the Pacific. But War in Europe for sure, it was a big, and then of course, what would be the best? You have the Battle of the Bulge Quad that John Butterfield did. It people still talk about that game. I'm just trying quickly to think about what else would those are sort of the games that come to mind. I mean, I could sit here and probably rattle off others, but those are certainly ones that if you ask somebody SPI, I think one of those would come up in somebody's discussion. I think it's interesting you say that. The legacy of SPI may be in just, it's one of those, Charles S. Roberts and Jim Dunnigan, Redmond Simonson are like the two cornerstones of a building, so everything, we all stand on the shoulders of others. And so I think that those are foundation stones of this hobby, obviously. And some of the games have been reprinted, which tells you that they were, a cut above in some cases. Not as many of them, but and it was just the raw creativity of SPI. I mean, it was there was really nobody said like you got to do it like this or you have to have a series game. Just you would feedback something in the magazine and it would get a green light. You get a budget and you'd go, and there was really nobody sitting there telling you like what to do.
Yeah.
And which is why 2 strikes and you're out, right? Get it done, do it right, and move on. And that was, and so, for me personally, it was a production. It was like the difference between Avalon Hill was sort of like the old world of everything is handmade and it's very slow. SPI was, industrialization. It was the scaling up of our, game production from 1 game a year to, 36.
Yeah.
And so it really changed the pace of production and design and what you could do with a group of maniacs who had no lives, to speak of. And that, so I think that to me is a legacy thing of that era, the 1970s.